Okay. Hi, I'm Sammy, and I'm refuting Monse on her argument on the present gun control laws. First off, her claim is that gun control laws in the U.S. are inadequate in protecting the lives of the American public. She does not lay out how she is going to support her claim after stating it, but goes straight into her argument, so we have no idea how her speech will play out. She addresses 3 secondary claims. First, about how simple it is to obtain a gun. Second, that gun control affects minorities different than whites. And third, the increase in the mass shooting epidemic. Her first secondary claim starts by explaining that it is way too simple for an American to get their hands on a gun. But she also goes on to state right after that even with current gun control policies, those who should not be handed firearms are still able to obtain them. I am not sure, as well as the audience, sorry, in which statement she will be going to support here, because she states 2 secondary claims back to back. This could be more clear in proving her point, and which of the following facts will support her secondary claims. In an attempt to prove her claim, she goes into explaining the NICS, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, in saying that they rely on states to submit mental health records, but that many states fail to do so reliably. Her fact in supporting this is an audit from the U.S. Department of Justice, in which they found in 2015 that New Jersey and Pennsylvania uploaded more than 1 million mental health records into the NICS system. However, these states have very large and dense populations despite their small size. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, New Jersey's population is almost 9 million, and Pennsylvania's is almost 13 million. She uses this information in comparison to Alaska, Montana, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Wyoming, and that they uploaded fewer than 110. The population of all these states combined does not even amount to New Jersey's population alone. That she then claims, again, that the NICS depends on each state to submit mental health records, but many states fail to do so. By repeating this claim, it weakens her argument when it should have been proven when claimed previously. Her claim is also weak in that although the NICS does rely on each state to provide mental health records, she does so in only providing one event that supports this, in which is insufficient. She says that Seung Hugh Cho should have been stopped from buying guns he used in the Virginia Tech attack, but Virginia failed to submit his mental health records to the FBI. However, the triage counselor who spoke with Cho, Cherry Lynch Conrad, said that Cho had threatened to take his home, had been admitted overnight to the hospital after his roommate became concerned when Cho threatened to take his own life. He denied any suicidal or homicidal ideations, said the comment he made was a joke, says he has no reason to harm himself and would never do it. There were no previous instances of violence or other events that were concerning, and it is very hard to determine someone's mental state based on one small instance like that. Along with this, although it may sound bad, but joking about killing oneself happens very often, and I'm guilty of this and many others as well. Her secondary claim is that current gun control affects minority groups different than it does whites. This claim addresses gun violence more than gun control, and there is not enough information provided to link the two in such a way. She then goes on to say right after that in order to protect the lives of all Americans, gun control needs to protect all Americans equally. However, what this statement does is completely assume that since there is more gun violence towards African Americans as a result, the laws we have in place are discriminatory towards other races or minority groups. This is not the case whatsoever and is very presumptuous since these events happen after the gun is distributed. According to the state of Working America, African Americans have the highest poverty rate at 27.4% as opposed to whites at 9.9%. It is no surprise that with poverty comes gangs, violence, and guns, but can be obtained in a multitude of ways, legally or illegally. However, her argument is about gun control and not violence, as stated in her main claim, so it fails to support it in this way. In her last secondary claim, she mentions that it addresses the mass shooting epidemic in America, where campuses and concerts used to be places of education and enjoyment are now hotbeds for sadistic, active shooters fiending for blood. This last supporting claim is not very clear because it is not straightforward and to the point and does not successfully argue how our current gun control laws are inadequate, as stated in her main claim. This instead argues how these places are turning into targets for shooters. Again, this discusses gun violence as opposed to gun control and should have been argued as opposed to gun control. She was going to argue that in her secondary claims.
Okay, the structural stuff at the beginning is pretty good, although you've got this kind of criticism about what her general argument is that was not very clear to me. You lay out what the main issues were that the advocate talked about and how you're going to respond to them in general. The first thing that you talk about is that, in essence, you're suggesting that we've got contradictory kinds of claims about whether or not the states are submitting accurate information. The comparisons between the states and all the numbers, the real question is, what do you do with that information? And there's not really an explanation about how the knowledge of somebody's mental health status is going to change and what the gun laws would be or how they would be different as a result. I think you're kind of focusing on the number comparison instead of what the inference is from this particular point. And I'm not sure that the advocate's inference was particularly clear. You do talk about the one event that happened with Cho, and this is the place where you do attempt to have some contradictory evidence suggesting that Cho didn't necessarily indicate the same amount of danger that has been suggested. You kind of give us some details to try and mitigate the notion that there's something particularly dangerous about him that would have stood out. The other question is, would the laws have prevented him from having access to guns had they in fact known about his detainment and his discussion of suicide and that sort of thing? I don't remember what the advocate's position was on this. I assume that it would have been that they would have been prohibited. I don't know that that's what the law was in Virginia, and there's not really a discussion of that here. So I think you've got a legitimate criticism. Look, it's hard to know what somebody's mental status is from these kinds of reports, so how would we be able to use this information anyway? That seems to be the general tone of your argument. And the jokes about killing yourself, I think people understand that sometimes people do that, but I imagine that the Cho case was probably a little bit different. Well, let's not get into that. That doesn't go anywhere. The analysis that you do on the second point, I think, is a valid one, where in essence the argument is shifted from an argument about gun control to an argument about gun violence. And the advocate has presupposed that there's a relationship between the absence of gun control and the high amount of violence that's going on. I think this would be one of those places where if you had some contradictory information, it would be really useful. For instance, places that have a high amount of gun control but also a very high amount of violence would undermine the argument that there is a relationship between those things. And there are plenty of examples. The two big examples that most people would point to would be Chicago and Washington, D.C., which have very strict gun control laws, but also have very high amounts of crime. So that kind of addresses the argument that you're making. You're kind of going about it in this kind of, well, let me explain what's problematic with their inference, and let me show you that this other claim's here, and you could just get cut right to the point and say, there is no relationship here between gun control and gun violence, and that would just be a lot clearer. Your last argument about mass shooting, I think, does the same sort of thing. There's an assumption that there's a relationship between the number of mass shootings and the amount of gun control that exists, and the question is, was there any evidence that demonstrated that? I don't remember what the advocate's argument was on that particular point. I know I've heard some evidence on those points, usually talking about restrictions that have been put into place in other parts of the world. You do come back to basically the same argument that you made on the previous point, that is, about gun violence and not about gun control. And again, the absence of any countervailing evidence on this point undermines the forcefulness of your answer. It's a reasonable press to make, but it's not exactly, something that I'd say afterwards and say, oh, well, I can clearly say your argument is the better one in this situation. And you want to leave us with a more forceful impact on those kinds of arguments. All right, thank you.